Thank you, Lisa, and welcome everyone. We're really excited to be here. As Lisa mentioned, we are from the University of Florida Literacy Institute, and you may be familiar already with our virtual teaching resource hub. We will be referring to that and some of the resources on it. And we also have some resources for you in handout form, and I'll let Valentina, who's one of my dear colleagues, who's in co-presenter, tell you a little bit about the handout before we get started.
Sure, thanks, Holly. So I will go ahead and put a PDF link that's a clickable Google Drive document that allows you to have the link to the resources as well as a description of it. So look for that in the chat in just a minute. Hopefully that allows you to be able to attend to the session and have all of the resources available. At the bottom of the handout, we also have the links to the main UFly website, our email, and Twitter, so that you can continue communicating with us after the session today. And thanks for being here.
Great. And so I'm going to go ahead and get us started so that we'll hopefully have time toward the end for questions. If you have questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat, and whoever is not speaking might have the opportunity to answer them, but we will likely hold most of the questions until the end. So let's go ahead and get us started. So we call this Power Tools for Word Work because we have some tools that we think are really powerful to use to teach kids how to read words. And we want to give you a little bit of background information, some of which you may be familiar with, some may be new to you, but we want to get everybody sort of on the same page with some of the conceptual understanding about what we're talking about, and then we'll get into the strategies. So to get started, first I want to just talk a little bit briefly about what we mean when we say the science of reading. This is all of the things that you're hearing at this conference are related to the science of reading in some way. But our definition of this is really the collective body of evidence that tells us things we should be doing when we're teaching reading. And the evidence comes from a variety of fields, in particular, the four that are listed here. We're most familiar with education, but psychology and linguistics in particular give us a lot of information that's important to incorporate as teachers. And then neuroscience is less directly related, but it also gives us some really important background information about how we need to be teaching reading. So when we say the science of reading, this is what we mean. If you want a little bit more detail about that, we also have a little video that is our explanation about what is the science of reading. And that is on your handout, and I bet Valentina is already putting the link to that in the chat as well. So also in terms of thinking about this conceptually, you are probably familiar with the simple view of reading, this idea that reading comprehension is the product of decoding and linguistic comprehension, often depicted as a mathematical formula, hence the word product. We multiply decoding and linguistic comprehension to get the outcome of reading comprehension. And in case you're not familiar with it, the idea here is that you have to have both of these present or you won't have reading comprehension. If you don't have decoding skill and linguistic comprehension, then reading comprehension will be 0. If you have both, then it's very likely that reading comprehension will also be intact. If either one is missing though, then reading comprehension can't happen. You have to have both of these. So it works in both directions. If you've got good decoding skill, but no language comprehension, you're not going to have reading comprehension. If you've got good language comprehension, but poor decoding, you also won't have good reading. If one of them is weak though, the best your reading comprehension can be is whatever degree of skill you have in the area in which you're weaker. So if your decoding skill is only halfway developed, your reading comprehension can really never exceed that. Same if it in reverse as well. If both areas are weak, then reading comprehension is going to be even weaker. So this way of conceptualizing it as a mathematical formula is really helpful because it helps us understand how important each of these two areas is. You may have also seen this depicted in this rope metaphor that Hollis Scarborough developed, with the idea that we've got two larger strands that get woven together, and each of the strands has smaller strands associated with it. And as these get woven together, then reading starts to become more skillful. So as language comprehension strands get woven together, then those strategies become more strategic. And as word recognition becomes more woven together, those skills are becoming increasingly automatic until we get to the point where we have skilled reading and fluent coordination of all those skills. Now, what's important to know here is that our focus today is really going to be on one part of this picture. So one part of the simple view and one part of the rope metaphor. So the idea here is that you need to develop both. We're certainly not neglecting linguistic comprehension. It's just that we only have a little bit of time together. So we're going to focus in on reading words. A little bit of background knowledge, if you're not already familiar, is that we want to share is Airy's phases of word recognition development. So Linnea Airy has done a tremendous amount of research to help us understand how kids learn to read words. And she describes these in phases very deliberately, because as she describes it, these phases overlap with one another, as opposed to stages where one might stop and the next one start. The phases overlap, and you may still see behaviors related to an earlier phase during whatever phase the student is mostly in at any given time. Also, I want to point out, I'm going to share with you 5 phases that Airy has described. Most of her writing about these phases really focus on 4 of the phases. There's only a couple of pieces where she's written about the 5th phase, but I think it's important to be aware of as well. So I'll include that. The way that kids develop through these phases, starting with the most basic, and that's called the pre-alphabetic phase. And in the pre-alphabetic phase, this is when kids see things that they can attach meaning to symbols, and it may not be individual actual words and letters. So when your 3-year-old sees the golden arches and says, "Oh, can we go to McDonald's?" You might think initially, "Oh my goodness, my baby can read," right? But of course, he's not actually reading. He's recognizing a logo. It's basically recognizing a picture and attaching it with what he knows that is connected with. And this is a very common thing early on. This is almost every child goes through this phase where they're attaching meaning to some symbol in their environment. One of the ways that this phase was sort of illustrated, an early study, as I was told, this was kind of an accidental discovery in that they were teaching little kiddos how to read consonant, vowel, consonant words. And they had a batch of words on cards. And what they found out was that all of the kids in the study seemed to identify one of those cards, one of those words very readily, much earlier than the others. And they couldn't figure out what about that word was easier to read until someone noticed that the card that word was on had a little thumbprint in the corner. And so then they attempted to replicate that thumbprint on a different word card, and all the kids identified the second word as the first word. And they did the same thing with a blank card, and kids were still identifying that card as saying that first word. So they were associating something other than the letters and sounds. They weren't using the alphabet, so hence the pre-alphabetic phase. Then kids move into what's called the partial alphabetic phase, where they start to notice letters in words, usually the first letter, sometimes the last letter, hardly ever the medial letters. And they overgeneralize. So maybe one time this word that starts with P was puppy. So now every time I see a word that starts with P, I'm going to first guess, oh, is that puppy, right? They're connecting it somehow a little bit, the letter and the sound with the word, but they're not going into the word. They're just using a part of it. So the partial alphabetic phase. The next phase is what's called the full alphabetic phase. This is true decoding. This is when I look at every letter in the word and combine the sounds associated with those letters to get a word. The full alphabetic phase is where we want to get kids in their decoding skill with our early phonics instruction. But it doesn't stop there. Once kids have gotten to the point of letter by letter decoding, then we want to see them start combining those letters and sounds into chunks. This is the consolidated alphabetic phase, where in a word like splash, they might notice that there's an SPL they've seen before, and I'm going to attach that chunk together with this other chunk I've seen before, ASH, to get the word, as opposed to saying splash. They're going splash and are able to decode more readily that way because they are noticing chunks. The last phase, and this is the one that is not written about in all of Ari's descriptions of these phases, but in some articles and chapters, she has written about this, is the automatic phase. And this is what you all are probably in as adult proficient readers. In the automatic phase, you recognize whole words so quickly that you're not even aware that you're doing any kind of processing. And it's just so automatic. Those words are secured in memory. You don't have to think about it. And so I'm going to put some text up on the screen here, and I just want you to attempt to read it as it comes up and see if you can do it. Ready? Here we go. Chances are you were able to read almost as fast as you saw those words appear. And you're maybe even waiting for the letters to appear because you're so automatic with it. And as adult proficient readers, that's what's expected, that you get to that point where it doesn't require you to stop and think about the parts of a word at all. You are able to process it. So word reading starts with just basically guessing based on a picture in the pre-alphabetic phase, to the point where you're reading words is so instantaneous that you don't have to really think about it. And so really most of the work that we're going to be talking about today is getting kids from the pre and partial alphabetic phase into the full alphabetic phase. That's where most early phonics instruction really focuses. Okay. So we want kids also to get to that point of automaticity, because automaticity is critical to allow for the purpose of all those skills to actually occur. The reason that we read words is to understand text, right? So if we think about text reading taking up a lot of our working memory, which is what happens when we're not fluent, we have to stop and decode each word, and it's laborious. Then as humans, we only have a certain amount of cognitive load available, or of working memory capacity available. And so if text reading, getting through those words, is not well developed and not automatic, then it takes up all of our capacity, and we have very little left over to try to make sense of the text. Whereas if it is more well developed and we can do it without thinking about it, then we can devote all of our cognitive effort to understanding the text. So that automaticity with word reading and moving through the text lets us devote more of our working memory capacity to comprehension. So we're going to talk a little bit about how kids learn to read little words. That's our focus today. We're not really going to get into multisyllabic words at this point. So in order to read words, we need to have knowledge of the alphabet. So when we see letters, we need to recognize them. We need to associate them with sounds. Whether or not they have to know the names of the letters is a little bit controversial. In the US, we tend to teach kids letter names from the beginning, and it seems to work fine. In some other countries, in the UK, for example, they teach just the sounds from the beginning, and kids may not learn the letter names for a while. And that also seems to work fine. There's really no clear research that one's better than the other. But recognizing the shape of the letter and associating it with the sound is critically important. Also having phonemic awareness, in particular, the capacity to blend sounds and segment sounds. And then being able to decode, connecting the sounds and letters to read words, and to encode, connecting the sounds and letters to spell words. So a little bit more about each of these. What am I talking about? In the area of alphabet knowledge, I'm referring to, well, there's really lots of ways to know a letter. Okay, so I can show you this letter and you can and ask you what's the name of this letter, and you can tell me that's an A. Or I might show you an array of 8 or 10 letters and ask you to point to the letter, in which case you have to find the letter. I'm giving you the name of the letter, A, find the A, and you have to recognize its shape. So that's the A and identify it that way. I can also ask you what's the sound of the letter. And you might know the sound A, or you might know A, You may have one sound associated, or you may have a multitude of sounds associated with that letter. And then finally, the form of the letter, knowing how to create that letter from scratch, where to start, which direction to move, and where to end up. All of that is knowing the letter. And the capacity to form the letter is actually a really critical piece of this. Knowing the letter sounds, you also want to know where in a word that particular sound and that letter are associated. Is that a grapheme that you only see at the beginning of a word? Maybe it's only in the middle of the word. And as we're learning new phoneme grapheme correspondences, it helps to have that as part of the initial instruction, is the placement of that particular grapheme in a word. On the Virtual Teaching Hub, we have grapheme introduction slides. This can be used in virtual instruction or in the classroom, but it gives a little explanation. This is directions for the teacher, but you would show your students, this is an SH. SH says shh, and then you go to the slide that says shh. The SH appears at the beginning of a word, like in ship or shop. It can also appear at the end of a word, like in rush and wish. And then it gives you some words to practice decoding words with that phoneme grapheme correspondence. When we're talking about letter formation, there's some things to focus in on. So you want to focus on what it is you're accomplishing. When kids are writing letters without being taught how to form them, they almost invariably will start forming their letters by writing letters from the bottom, the baseline, and moving up. And if you have looked at different methods and styles of handwriting instruction, none of them use bottom-up formation. They all have essentially the same formation. If you're using like a Zahner-Bloser approach, or the handwriting without tears, or Danielian, they all basically start in the same place, move in the same direction, and end up in the same place. The product may look slightly different, but the process is very similar. And the reason for that is those are the most efficient ways to form those letters. And they're efficient in terms of writing strings of letters to create words. So letter formation, learning how to form letters correctly, helps with a lot of different things. So first of all, if you can form a letter, you're more likely to remember that letter and recognize that shape. If you form letters correctly, properly, efficiently, it's actually facilitating you becoming a fluent writer. You can write words quickly. That part's kind of obvious. The part that's not as obvious is that writing letters fluently actually also helps improve the quality of your written expression. And it kind of relates to what I was just showing you about decoding and comprehension. The more fluent you are with decoding words, the more effort you can expend on comprehending the text. Very similarly, the more fluent you are with writing letters, the more of your cognitive effort you can devote to the message that you're trying to convey. So the quality of your written expression is better if you're fluent in your handwriting skills. So in learning correct letter formation, we're talking about learning things like circles and curves, vertical and horizontal lines. Slanted lines tend to be the hardest ones for kids. And also learning both uppercase and lowercase letters. Uppercase letters, although they're less commonly used in written expression, they are usually easier for kids to learn because they're more different from one another. And uppercase letters also support the development of knowledge of lowercase letters, because many of the lowercase letters are just smaller versions of the uppercase. And so you just have a few new forms to learn once you've learned the uppercase. In addition to letter formation, we need to make sure kids are learning phonemic awareness. And so phonemic awareness is both the processing of sounds. So we think of a phoneme as the smallest unit of sound in spoken language, right? And phonemic awareness is not knowing the letter sounds. It's what do you do with those sounds once they've entered your brain? How are you processing that phonemic information? But phonemic awareness is also awareness of how those phonemes are produced. So in education, we tend to think about a phoneme just being the smallest unit of sound in spoken language. But in linguistics, most linguists think about a phoneme as both that sound that we hear and the physical act of producing that sound. So becoming phonemically aware means I have to be aware of what my mouth did to produce that sound. So you can look at these mouth pictures and narrow down what possible sounds could have been produced there. When my lips are together, that can only be a b or a p or an Those are the only sounds that are produced with lips together like that. The middle one on the top row, it's either going to be a ch or a sh or a j or a zh. Those are the only sounds produced with that lip formation. So becoming familiar with what sounds, how they're formed, and how some sounds are formed very similarly to each other is really an important part of developing phonemic awareness. So, another piece about sound production that's important to know is that when we're producing consonants, the definition of a consonant is that essentially there's a obstruction of air coming out that's formed by two parts of your articulatory anatomy touching each other. Maybe your lips coming together, your teeth coming together, your tongue on the back of there's lots of different things that you can do to produce consonants. Producing vowels is very different in that you aren't connecting one part of your vocal anatomy to another. The difference is how wide your mouth is open. Is it ah, or is it stretched out this way, e, or is it rounded, ooh? So what shape your lips take, and then how lax or tense your cheeks and your tongue are, where your tongue is placed. It's much more subtle, the distinctions in the articulatory gestures for vowels. This is why kids tend to have a lot more difficulty with vowels than with consonants in general. So one of the resources that we have for you is this Blendable Sounds video, because when we're teaching sounds to kids, we need to make sure that the sounds we're modeling are sounds that can be blended together. If I teach kids that B says ba and G says ga, when they go to decode the word big, they're going to actually say ba-iga. And it's going to be really hard to get from that to the word big. That's a more obvious one. I see a lot, teachers will say that W says wa and Y says ya. Well, really, they don't. That's not how those sounds are produced in spoken language. I don't say wa-ish, I say wish. So teaching that the sound for W is instead of wa is really important. So this is just a very quick review of just the letters of the alphabet and their most common sounds. There are some other good resources on the internet for blendable sounds, but this is just one that we'll provide for you. When we're talking about decoding, remember that we're talking about translating print into speech. So I see a word written and I say what that word is, okay? K, at, cat. This also involves taking those sounds and blending them together. So phonemic blending is a really critical piece here. The opposite of decoding is encoding, so translating speech into print, saying the word and then figuring out how to write that down. And this requires phonemic segmentation skills. So when we're talking about developing phonemic awareness, really the important skills to develop are blending and segmenting. There are other skills that you can work on, and there are other levels you can work on, but really none of the others matter a whole lot. What you need to be able to do is to blend and segment phonemes. All of this contributes to a process, a mental process called orthographic mapping. This process explains how children learn to read words by sight, how they spell words from memory, and how they can acquire words from print. Efficient orthographic mapping, or the connection between graphemes and phonemes, happens when we have phonemic awareness and we have grapheme phoneme knowledge, and then we practice through decoding and encoding word work, these processes. So this idea of orthographic mapping happens during both encoding and decoding, and doing one reinforces both. So we want to do both to make sure that they're both reinforced sufficiently. In terms of encoding, this means I say a word like frog, and then I say, okay, how am I going to spell that word frog? Let me think. Frog has a ah, g. What did I just do? I did phonemic segmentation of the word frog. Then I think, okay, how can I connect each of those sounds with the grapheme? I can say that's an F, that's an R, ah, that's an O, G, that's a, or G, that's a G. So I've gone from saying the whole word, segmenting the word, connecting the word with letters. Decoding is just the same process in reverse. I see the word on the page and I say, okay, F, that says R, that says O, that says ah, and G, that says G. Let me take G, blend those sounds together, and I get the word frog. Okay, so that same process, in this case, it's a one-on-one, one-to-one correspondence. Each sound has a letter. If I have a word like fish, I've got 3 sounds, but 4 letters. So I need to connect the grapheme SH with one sound, sh. So the process of orthographic mapping is really straightforward when there's a one-to-one correspondence. It's a little bit trickier when we have graphemes that include more than one letter, like SH. But the same process is happening. It's a little trickier still when we have irregular words, but we can still decode these words. We just have to associate the sound with a grapheme that may not normally be associated with it. But in a word like said, the s and the d are spelled exactly like we would expect. It's just one sound in the middle, the eh, that's spelled in a different way. So teaching irregular words using this same process helps kids learn the words much better than just having it be something that you use flashcards with, or try to get them to learn in a different way. So I'm going to turn it over to Valentina to take us through some of the strategies that we can use in order to read little words. So Valentina, let me see if I can give you remote control. There you go.
Thanks, Holly. Perfect. So now that Holly has talked about some of the background of what kids need to know in order to read little words, I get to talk to you about some practices that we hope either confirm things you've been doing in the classroom or give you ideas for practices you can start implementing for reading instruction and intervention. So the first strategy that we'll talk about is the use of Okonin boxes. So as you may know, one of the earliest researchers to link phonemic awareness to reading development was D.B. Okonin back in the 60s. And how Okonin intended for Okonin boxes to be used was for phoneme segmentation using chips or markers. And so the idea was for students to identify what a picture was, say the word, and then segment each of the phonemes in that word using chips. So for key, it would look like this. K, E, oops, there it is. And then for cat, it would go k, a, t. And for frog, r, a, g. So as you can see, each segmented phoneme gets its own chip inside its own box, including what sometimes gets referred to as consonant blends or clusters in the word frog. Because we hear each individual sound in the beginning of frog, each counter or each phoneme gets its own box. And so Okonon boxes are a really great way to have students really focus in on those phoneme level skills. So being able to hear and segment each individual sound they hear in a word. And what's really helpful about them and the use of the boxes is that we can incorporate letters early on in instruction, as soon as students are beginning to learn those letter sound correspondences, like you see here in these examples. So as we've mentioned, Okonon boxes do help improve phonemic awareness, so students' ability to hear all the individual sounds in words. And they also help promote students' ability to segment phonemes, so phoneme segmentation skills, which is a really critical first step in being able to encode or spell words. When students are asked to encode a word, they have to hear the word, be able to hear all the individual phonemes, and then match all those phonemes to the grapheme that makes that sound. So more recently, researchers and scholars, I'm sure you've heard conversations about the importance of adding letters to this method. So including letters allows us to continue to support that phonemic awareness that we know is an important skill to develop, but also help students improve their understanding of the alphabetic principle, so that letters and sounds work together in really systematic ways to form words. It also helps promote orthographic mapping, which Holly talked about earlier. And then it provides a lot of opportunities for students to practice decoding. So because we're inserting letters, it allows students to practice reading words as they're engaging in this activity. So in UFly, we talk about the steps for using Okonon boxes in a really kind of particular way. So we wanted to share those steps with you today. The first step is having students count with you the sounds in the word. And so, for example, in the word fish, we would help students be able to recognize how many sounds or phonemes that word has. So you'd help the student count out. Sh. Some really important things to point out is to ensure that when the student is looking at you counting the sounds, you're modeling left to right, so student sees the way that the word would be written. And once students identify that the word fish has 3 sounds, that tells them that we need 3 boxes in order to spell this word. And so the next step is drawing 1 box for each sound. It's really helpful for many students that are having difficulties with decoding and encoding to hear the sounds one more time as you're doing this step. So as you're drawing the boxes for fish, you would repeat the sounds yet again. So, eventually, students could draw the boxes independently, but when they're first being introduced to the strategy, we recommend that you help support this step. And so as mentioned previously, you can begin just using chips or markers to represent the sounds at first. So for fish, we would move counters up again as we say each sound. And then if students need it, you can repeat the sounds yet again as you move the counters out of the boxes, again, as you're physically moving the chips. As we mentioned, incorporating letters in the boxes is a really, really important part of them being able to practice both encoding and decoding. And if students are needing this kind of method in their intervention, it's likely that this is going to be a very scaffolded process. You can't just provide the boxes and say, here, okay, now spell fish. We did great segmenting, maybe eventually after using this method repeatedly, but at first it would look a little bit like this. So prompting the student to first identify the sound and then the letter that matches that sound. So what's the first sound you hear in fish? The student would say, and then you can prompt, okay, what letter makes that sound? F, go ahead and put it in the box, and they write it in. The student is doing the writing again so that they can practice encoding. Okay, what's the next sound you hear? Good. What letter makes that sound? I. Go ahead and put it in. This kind of scaffolded process also gives you an opportunity to provide corrective feedback if it's necessary as you're encoding. And what's the last sound you hear? Shh, good. What 2 letters make that sound? SH. As you can see here with the letters in the boxes, this provides a really great opportunity to incorporate decoding practice where the student can segment and blend the word that they've just spelled. So ish, fish, as you're touching underneath each box. And then of course we want to end with them writing the whole word under the boxes so that they see it as a real word and not just this activity that they do with their teacher in boxes. And of course, encouraging yet again that the students say the sounds as they're spelling. So ish, and then you can even have them decode the word one last time. What's the word we spelled again? Fish. So as you could see from my brief overview of our steps is that there's a lot of repetition of just segmenting the individual phonemes of both encoding and then decoding the word. So this kind of practice of encoding and decoding can also be done with manipulative letters, as you see here. When we use manipulative letters, it's really important to begin with a target word. Like in this example, I would say, okay, we're going to begin with the word sip. And then as you'll hear from different prompts that I use, students are able to practice either encoding or spelling or decoding based on what I tell them or ask them to do. And so if I say, okay, change sip to lip, they need to encode that word. They need to figure out what's different. So they'd have to figure out, okay, lip, I need to take out the S and add an L. And then of course you can have them read the word lip. Okay, then I can ask them to move something and say, okay, put the F in front of the L. What word do you have now? And because I asked what the new word is, they're practicing decoding during this practice. Students can also do more advanced encoding practice with manipulative letters. So if I have the word flip, what do I need to change to make the word flop? Listen to my sounds. Flop, flop. And the student with that guidance would know to change the I to an O. And then again, you can ask them to decode the word. What word did we spell again? And they read flop. Then I can make the change again, a more difficult change for them to identify that change in vowel. What's this word? What's this new word? Flap. And then they can also make even more advanced encoding changes by changing letters in the final placement of the word. So if I have the word flap, what do I need to change to make the word flag? So that requires the student to recognize that the change is at the end of the word or in that final placement. And they know to take away the P and add the G to spell flag. And again, I can ask them to decode the word once again. So both of these methods can be combined in a really effective way, again, to help students with phoneme segmentation and decoding and encoding. And so the first step would be to tell the students the word that they're going to spell or encode. And they would use the chips just like before to segment those phonemes. So if we had the students, if we wanted the students to spell the word mat, we would first segment with the chips, helping them. Okay, let's say the sounds. Mat. Good. Now that we've heard all the sounds and we know this word has 3 sounds, 3 graphemes, we can match the letters that make those sounds. So what's the first sound we heard? Good. What letter makes that sound? They would move or write in the M. Okay, what's the next sound? They would identify the sound and then add the letter and then continue on. We can use the chips still and these pre-made boxes to then ask students to encode new words. So if we wanted to make the word mat into mats, at, they know that they need to add 1 additional chip at the end first. And because we added that sound, they need to now add a letter that corresponds with that sound. So that helps them recognize that they need to add an S at the end. And then we can continue on. For example, if we wanted to make the word mats into cats, we can use this to help them recognize where that change is. At. So they need to know to move the M, and add the C to spell this new word. As you could see for this example, the chip stayed the same color, but if you really wanted to emphasize that sound changed to a new sound or phoneme, you could use an additional color chip to really reinforce that as well. So some of the things we like to note related to manipulative letters is that it's best to use lowercase letters of just one color. So of course, students will be exposed to lowercase letters most in text, but also the idea of using just one color is really important for students, especially in kindergarten and first grade, where they're still becoming proficient in letter identification. So once students become really proficient in letter identification, the color matters less. You can use the sets from the Dollar Tree that are multicolored, but when students are still in that partial alphabetic or pre-alphabetic phase, it's really important that they are paying attention to the shape of the letter rather than other known attributes like color. So we wanted to mention that. We also, I mentioned that target word when I talked about SIP. So it's important that we're choosing appropriate words to be those target words. So those words that we begin word work with. So as you can see from this list, the words sip, snack, and rain are completely regularly spelled. And so these words allow us to make many other new words from them. Sip to lip, snack to smack, rain to pain, etc. And so those are great examples of appropriate target words. This list on the right, soup, ocean, skeleton, have a lot more irregularities in them, and they don't allow for many words beyond that. And so these are not great examples. Anytime that you find yourself as an adult and an educator looking at a word and thinking, okay, what letter makes what sound, that probably tells you that it's not a great word to use as a target word in word work. So we also like to talk about 3 rules of word work. The first being that we can conduct word work at varying levels of difficulty. So the first level is the onset rhyme level, where you can see in this word chain example, only the onset part of the word changes. So these are most frequently used in classrooms by saying, okay, change sit to bit and so on. So that's the lowest level of difficulty. The phoneme level requires students to pay attention to changes in the initial, medial, or final placement, as you see here in this example. And then we can also use advanced patterns to further make the difficulty level. So you can see in this example that the students that were working with this word chain had been exposed to vowel teams. And so this requires more advanced kind of skill for word work. Our second rule, as you've heard me talk about already, is that we're helping students both encode and decode words. So a lot of times, the easiest kind of word work prompts is to say, change this to that, to this, to that. But we want to make sure that we're providing prompts that also require that the student decode words. And so encoding prompts, again, like I said, would be just change this to that, like change mat to sat. But for decoding, we're either making a change for the student to read a new word or having the student make one kind of change to read the new word. On this slide, we have some examples of additional prompts for encoding. So again, the change sat to hat, but also what letter do you need to change sat to hat? This kind of prompt allows students to practice encoding, but without that same exact wording. This is a great prompt to use if you're still teaching virtually or through hybrid options, because students can tell you what to change and you could manipulate it if they're not able to control the screen or anything like that. And then what would you have to do to change cat to cat? Same kind of idea. They can tell you, and then of course, if they have access to the manipulative letters, they can do the change in order to encode that new word. Decoding prompts, again, changing a letter to another letter. You can also, instead of focusing on letter names, is say the sound. So change the in sat to what, read your new word, or what's your new word. And then again, you can do more difficult types of changes that require students to decode words. Like if I put an S right here in cat, what word does that spell? And that could be maybe cats or cast, depending on where the teacher places that S. So again, more difficult decoding tasks for the student. And so the last rule is that you can use both real and nonsense words. Of course, you want to use primarily real words because those are the words that students will see in text. But you can also include nonsense words every 8 to 10 words. We typically use them in our word chains to be able to connect between real words. And also it helps you see if students can apply those phonics and decoding skills to those nonsense words. If it is a nonsense word, it's really important that you point this out so that students don't think it's a real word. And then for real words that may have definitions that your students haven't been exposed to yet, it's really helpful to think of those ahead of time and think of a really, really brief explanation for what those words are so that it doesn't break up your word work practice, but it also supports their language and vocabulary as you're working on word work. So here is a video of myself working on word work with the students for intervention, and you'll hear me make prompts that require him to encode and some to decode.
Word. Flat. All right. Now I want you to, we're going to squeeze a P here in the middle. Let's read our new word.
Splat.
What? You are such a good reader. Like splat the cat. That's right. We have the word splat. Can you make the word split? But listen to the sounds. It. What do you need to change?
The A and the
Good spelling. And what word do you have?
split.
Split. All right. Now we're going to take away a letter. Can you take away the letter that says, put it down at the bottom. Good listening.
So I'll go ahead because of time. So in that example, again, you heard me say the prompts to either have him encode or decode words. You also saw that he needed a lot of explicitness with tracking and sweeping to both segment and blend. So that's the beauty of magnetic or manipulative letters that allow students to do that. And then, of course, you heard in the video that the student needed a lot of behavior-specific praise during the instruction, and so you heard some of that being provided throughout. This activity could be done with a set of regular magnetic letters while teaching virtually. We will skip that video for today though. We do have a resource on the hub that provides kind of a low-tech version of manipulative letters that are just on a PowerPoint or Google Slides, which is really handy to have for intervention. These letters also exist in larger foam. These are foam letters on a felt board that students are engaging with during a workstation or center. They've done so much kind of word work activities during small group and whole group instruction that the students are able to take turns being teacher and practicing either encoding or decoding more independently with concepts that are review concepts for them. You can see the same kind of idea with just grapheme cards. This is what we call a blending board with the grapheme cards. You can see that same kind of focus on tracking to say or segment each phoneme in the word, and then of course sweeping to blend. You don't need a blending board to do this. You could also just stack the grapheme cards on the table for an even more simple activity. We do have a printable version of what we call the word work mat. This mat was really helpful to me as a classroom teacher and as a special education teacher that traveled throughout classrooms because we use Velcro for this tool. And what's great about this is that you can begin just with the alphabet at the beginning of the year if you have younger learners or your students are in intervention. And as you teach graphemes, you can add them to the left side. As you can see, these graphemes are kind of grouped in categories. The colors don't mean anything. Those are just helpful for students to be able to return the grapheme tiles to a specific place. And then I did want to point out this version of the printable word work mat does have the vowels in red, again, just for organizational purposes, but we do have an option on the printable. The last page allows you to print it just in blue if your students are in kindergarten and first grade and still mastering letter recognition. What you'll also notice with the alphabet is that it does include mini letters underneath on the background, so that students do return these in a specific place and that the alphabet remains in alphabetical order in order to make the word work more efficient, because students know where to look for words, or for, letters. Here's a quick video of this being used in small group for intervention. As you can see, the file folder is folded in half, so the students are only working right now on building words with the alphabet letters.
Yes. How do we make the word wet? What do you need to change? Show me you're ready to read, Amy. Awesome job. Pointing underneath, showing me you're ready. Saying the sounds. Wet.
So using this tool in small group does require that your students kind of procedures for it. So you heard me say, oh, good job showing me you're ready to read, like pointing underneath that first letter so that students can provide a core response and read the word together after they've encoded the word. You also heard students saying the sounds to figure out what's different. And so again, a really helpful tool because you can have students bring it to the teacher table, go down to the carpet with them. And so we are big fans. You can use the same tool for one-on-one intervention, and we will skip those videos for today. But there are a lot of videos on the hub if you are interested in more teaching examples. In this picture, you see that the teacher is using the mat for whole group instruction. So interns and volunteers are a great way to make this happen. This teacher had her intern work on a class set of word work mats. And then you can see that she uses the projector and a ladybug. I forget what the actual term for that is right now at the second, but you get the idea, to project her version, her copy of the word work map for students to be able to check their encoding or their spelling of the word she's having them spell. So here are just some of the versions of manipulative letters we discussed. On the hub, we actually have just printable grapheme tiles that students can cut out if your students are still working from home and don't have access to these types of materials. We also have virtual versions of these that we will talk more about in just a minute. And so to summarize, before I hand it back to Holly, powerful word work really helps promote phonemic awareness. So this focus on really attending to individual sounds in words. It helps build encoding skills, so students are repeatedly spelling words with concepts that have even just recently been taught or previously learned concepts that they're reviewing. Helps build decoding skills, and helps promote orthographic mapping that Holly talked about. So really helping kids get these words into their sight word vocabulary through this kind of practice. And so I will go ahead and stop controlling the screen so Holly can come back to it to talk more about planning.
There we go. Thank you, Valentina. So let's talk a little bit about planning for word work. We have some procedures that we have found to be really successful in this regard. And we're just going to share some of those tips with you. So the first one is to follow a scope and sequence, whether that is something that comes with your core curriculum or one of your supplemental materials. If you don't already have a scope and sequence available, we have one on the hub that is one scope and sequence. There isn't one correct one. There are variations, but they all follow the same basic patterns, moving from simpler grapheme phoneme correspondences to more complex ones. In addition to having a scope and sequence, knowing something about how to actually practice these things. there was a study that came out about a year ago that indicated something really important. This idea distinguishing connected phonation versus segmented phonation. And the idea between connected phonation is instead of, for a word I'm decoding, like sun, instead of saying s, n, with breaks between the sounds, I'm tying it all together. I'm saying sun. I'm connecting the sounds in the word as I produce that. Now, you can only do that if the initial sound is a continuous sound. So I can do this with words like sat, mat, and rat. Oops, but I can't do that with bat, pat, and cat, because those words begin with a stop sound. But what's cool about this process is, in this study, they discovered that teaching kids to do this with continuous sounds actually transfers the skill over to blending with stop sounds at the beginning. So that part is what is really powerful about this, and understanding and using this procedure can really make a difference for your initial decoding skills. In addition, we use word chains. You heard Valentina mention, she showed you some examples of word chains. And so I just want to take you through how we develop effective word chains and what makes a good word chain. So this is just the sequence of words that we're using in order to do practice with encoding and decoding skills. So you can have a short word chain or a long word chain, but we're just changing a little bit of the word at a time to make a new word. So as Valentina mentioned, you can use different levels of difficulty. So the onset rhyme level is the most basic, and having a simple onset is the simplest version of that. So sit, bit, lit, hit, fit, wit, pit, those are all very simple changes. I can increase the difficulty a little bit by having onsets that have more than one letter in them. That's a little bit trickier. Changing pit to spit and spit to split is a little trickier than sit to bit to lit to hit. When I get to the phoneme level, I can start, this is when I'm moving different parts of the word around. So I might just have the initial sound different, or it might be the medial sound, or it might be the final sound. And you see all of those represented here. And again, I can make that more complicated by both having more than one letter in one of the positions, or moving things around, like from slit to list is a pretty tricky kind of change to make. Then we can have also advanced patterns that use things like vowel teams in them, and making sure that the rest of the word is the same. I'm only changing that one part out. So how do you actually use a word chain? Well, all of the activities that you've heard about so far can be incorporating word chains. So Elkonin boxes, manipulative letters, blending boards. So in Elkonin boxes, to do practice with a word chain, you can do the same kind of initial practice that we talked about, incorporating, what says F, good, what says I, and so forth, and filling in the boxes for the Elkonin boxes. But then, instead of just leaving it there and moving on to a completely different word, you can change a little bit at a time. So you can say, what would happen if I changed the F in fish to a D? What word do you have? That would be a decoding change. Or I could say, change dish to dash and let the student make the change, an encoding change. Change dash to bash, okay, encoding. Or what would I need to do to change bash to bath? And that would be, that's encoding. What if I changed the SH to a TH? What word do you have? That would be decoding. Okay, so you can also do this with manipulative letters the same way that Valentina described. You're just planning that word work out using a word chain. Same kind of changes, but it's very systematically planned out. Okay, same encoding, decoding. And then with blending boards, you can do this with the traditional word grapheme cards. changing words one phoneme at a time. You can also do this with the virtual blending board, which I'll show you in a moment. So what makes a good word chain? Because I've seen some really bad ones too. So I want to make some distinctions here. A good word chain, first of all, changes only one phoneme at a time. So changing sit to pit, pit to pig, pig to dig, dig to dip. I'm changing in these cases, I'm keeping the I the same and changing just the initial or final phoneme. A bad word chain would change more than one phoneme at a time, changing sit to sap, only keeping the initial sound the same. It's not a good idea. A good word chain uses only one pronunciation of a grapheme. So a lot of graphemes are associated with multiple phonemes, and sometimes a phoneme is associated with multiple graphemes. And you don't want to confuse kids with those things when you're practicing, especially if it's something you've just introduced. So for example, changing good to hood, hood to hook, hook to look would be a good sequence. Changing good to food, food to hood, hood to hoop. You see how I'm changing the sound for O back and forth. You don't want to do that kind of change. Again, when you have these different levels of difficulty, you can also incorporate some nonsense words. Find it helpful to have a nonsense word as a bridge between two words going from log to gag. I couldn't think of something in between, so I threw in gog. When you are planning a sequence, it's good to also think about what will you say to make sure you're alternating between your encoding and decoding practice. So begin with the word tea, now change it to bean, that's encoding. Change the M to a T, what word did you get? That would be decoding. Change that to beast, encoding, and so forth. So planning for this alternating encoding and decoding practice makes for a better word chain. We have a whole little video just about word chains and using them for encoding and decoding practice. So if you want to learn more about that, then I encourage you to watch that full video. On the Virtual Teaching Hub, we have some tools that can be used for this. These are the power tools that we were talking about. If you go to the Virtual Teaching Resource Hub and you scroll down, you'll see these four tabs, and you want to click on the Instructional Activities tab. In that tab, when you get there, you'll see a decoding and encoding choice. And so you would click on that and you'll see all of these choices: word work, big words, word cards and lists, and games and printables, lots of things there that can be useful. On there is an explanation of Aries phases that we mentioned earlier. And in that word work section, you will find the apps that we've talked about. These are also on the handout in the Google doc that Valentina linked, but you have our virtual blending board and our virtual word work mats. The virtual mat gives you, the beginner one is the one that with just the letters of the alphabet, and the intermediate one has all of the other graphemes as well. We also strongly recommend you check out Devin Kern's Finder tool that's linked there. The Finder tool is a good way to help generate ideas of words that you can put in your word work chains. The virtual word work mat uses these things just like we were talking about. This is Valentina doing interacting with the student using the virtual word work mat.
Follow my arrow. Rob. Close. What letter is this? A neck. Good reading. Now I'm going to cover up this letter. Let's read this new word. Drop.
Right, so in that case, you saw that she was actually stacking up the letters. You can pile them up. There's not an infinite number of letters under each tile, but there are quite a few. And so you don't have to move them off or put them back. You can just stack them up in the places. Here's a slightly more advanced one.
What did you make?
Start.
Okay, close your eyes. I get to make the next one. Okay, open your eyes. What word did I make?
Oh, that's part.
Great reading. Okay, now can you help me turn part into park? Let's sound out the word park. Ready?
Ark.
Okay, you've got control. Go ahead and turn part into park.
So in that example, you saw instead of stacking the grapheme tiles, she just kind of threw it off the edge of the browser and it disappears. So that's another option for changing. And she also said that to the student that she has control. So she was using Zoom and gave her remote control. Not all of the video conferencing platforms allow that, but if they do, that's great. You may also notice that the AR, there isn't another one underneath it. So the graphemes on the left only have one of each of the cards. So when you're using a word work chain with the word work mat, it looks just like what we were demonstrating there. And you can, again, pile them up, you can move them around, you can decide what goes in front of and over each one. But again, you're going to be decoding and encoding and alternating that practice. Some important features of the word work mat. One is that it's used for decoding and encoding accuracy. So the idea here is thinking about what letter makes what sound and where in the word is each sound and so forth, and really getting accurate with your decoding and encoding. And it's both decoding and encoding. Another feature of this is that either the teacher or the student can do the manipulation. So the examples you saw were both virtual teaching. You can use this in the classroom using it on a smartboard, or if you have a touchscreen TV in your classroom, and have kids move the graphemes that way. If you have tablets, the kids can have their own and each be manipulating their own, just like the word work mat with the Velcro, but doing it with the virtual version of it. You can also have either the teacher or the student track under the letters. So you saw when Valentina, when they were sounding out crop and she said something else, something crob, she had her go back and Valentina was tracking while the student was sounding it out. The other app that we have is the virtual blending board. And this is set up a little bit differently. This one is set up for the teacher to do all the manipulations. As you can see here, it's divided into initial sounds, medial sounds, and final sounds, and then also the final E or plural at the end. And so they're set up so that you click on a tile and it changes just whatever letter or letters are in that position in the word. So one thing I want to point out is that we typically would not teach our consonant blends as a unit, and we certainly wouldn't have them in the same Alconen box. But from what the student is paying attention to, this word up here, that's the focus. We have it down here for the teacher to use as a unit because that's the only way that we can change things in the initial or final portion of the word. So I just wanted to point that out in case you were confused about why we would have a consonant blend on the same tile, because the student isn't supposed to be attending to the tiles. So what that looks like, now you notice also that this one has fewer graphemes there. This student hasn't learned all those graphemes. So when you're starting a lesson, you choose which graphemes you want to use in your interaction. And we're setting it up now. We're working on some edits to the virtual blending board so that you can actually save. Once you have selected, save it as a group, have a group's name or an individual child's name, that this particular set of graphemes is saved for them. So you don't have to select all of them each time. It'll already be pulled up. You may also notice that over on the right here, the words appear as they are being made. So let's just watch a little clip of this.
Back. Very good. How about now? You got it. Ooh, lack. Good. How about now? Ooh, black. Yeah, black. You got it. And now?
So you see how the words are showing up over here when they're finished with all of the changes here. This little guy likes to read his list of whatever's there. It only saves the last 9 or 10 words. So with the blending board, you can use a word chain just the same way. This one has even fewer graphemes chosen. One of the things that you may notice with this, I'm not sure if this will actually give us any good examples, but there are places, see where how the P here is grayed out. That's because if you selected that here, it would make a nonsense word. And you could select it and still have the student decode the nonsense word. It's just alerting you to the fact that it's not a real word. So you need to be prepared to explain that to your student. But again, the word chain uses the kinds of changes we talked about, and the blending board keeps track of the last set of words that you've spelled. So for the virtual blending board, this one is used for both accuracy and automaticity, but just with decoding. We're not asking the student to spell words here, we're asking them to decode. And really the focus is on automaticity. Let's see how quickly you can do this. So we might use the word work mat initially, and once kids start to develop pretty good accuracy, switch over to the blending board, or initial work with the blending board can be accuracy and then moving into automaticity. And again, the teacher does all the manipulation with the blending board. This one does require a little bit of advanced planning, and it should focus on previously taught concepts. So you have to select the graphemes that you want to use. So Valentina, I don't think we actually have time. We're almost out of time. So I'm going to skip trying them out, and we are going to, you all have the apps and we hope that you will try them out. I just want to point out one other little feature that's kind of nice. If you are using this on Zoom, you can see this is way too many, kind of overwhelming to see all of these graphemes at once. Some kids it won't matter, but for some kids it might. In which case it's helpful to focus them a little bit. And you can do that if you're using Zoom as your video conferencing platform. They have a really nice feature. If you select the advanced screen sharing version up at the top and choose portion of screen rather than the whole screen, then you get this green rectangle showing up, and you can change the size and shape and placement of it. And so the way that I have it placed here, the student is only going to see the word. They won't see any of the other stuff on the page. So their screen looks like this. For kids who are easily distracted by the other stuff that you're doing, this is a nice solution to that. So to reiterate what Valentina mentioned earlier is that powerful word work promotes phonemic awareness, builds encoding skills, builds decoding skills, and promotes orthographic mapping. So we want to leave a few moments for questions. Do we have questions already in the chat, or anything that anybody has to ask us at this point?
Feel free to unmute or type in the chat and I can read it out for you. We did want to remind you one last time, Lisa has been putting the feedback form link in the chat. So if you could please take a few moments to fill that out after the session, that would be great.
Yes, it
If
sounds
someone
like
had a question, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. We were really excited, I think it was after day 2, with a lot of this phonemic awareness work. And I'm curious how this fits in with Dr. Carrie Thomas Beck's work and Dr. Mary Dahlgren's in like not organizing things alphabetically and really focusing on kind of those sound walls. I'm just curious how that fits in together.
That's a really good question. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see a little bit better. There's a little bit of a difference in terms of what the aims are. So in terms of introducing sounds and using a sound wall, that's the initial introduction or connection between the sound and its placement. So focusing in on those articulatory gestures that we were talking about, that aligns really nicely. And then really understanding which ways we can spell this particular phoneme. So most of the sound wall work, as you introduce a sound spelling, you would put it up associating it with that sound. What this is then applying those skills in reading and spelling words. So I think, I didn't see the sessions that you're talking about, but I'm familiar with Mary Dahlgren's work. And as far as I know, that this would be a really nice match, that this would align really well. We do a lot of work really similar to the sound walls, that how she does it, and it works really nicely in the way that we are introducing it. So
Thanks, Holly. A few other great questions in the chat. One in particular was asking if we ever focus on meaning of the words after students decode them, that this would be great for English language learners.
yeah, absolutely. And it's really important, and you mentioned this, but keeping in mind that for young children, a lot of simple, real words are nonsense words to them. So, you know, I always use the example, we've just been reading sat and cat and mat, and then I spell the word vat, V-A-T. Well, a 5 or 6-year-old may have no idea what a vat is. So I'm going to incorporate in there just a super brief explanation. You know, a vat is like a really big pot of something. You know, they don't have to understand how vats are used and what it looks like necessarily, just something that indicates what it is. So just having that that much of an explanation is usually plenty. If you are working with English learners, it might be helpful to have picture cards available to connect with the word to help kind of cement that understanding a little bit better.
Really quick, I know it's 2 o'clock, so if some of you have to run, thank you so much for attending. Another use of visual supports in addition to during word work is those Grapheme introduction slides that Holly talked about. I've been strategic at times of selecting words to help build vocabulary for English language learners or students with language impairments in my classroom, where the words come up for those resources, but also a picture of the word, and being really strategic about the words we're using for introducing phoneme grapheme concepts as well. Do we have time for more questions, Lisa, or should we wrap up now?
I have to go, which I think might end the meeting, but I will, if that doesn't end the meeting, please continue to chat.
Okay, if you, thank you, Lisa. I did save the chat, and so if your questions did not get answered, feel free to email the UFly email, which is at the bottom of the handout. And thanks again.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.